Chapter 1. The Wet Thing in the Hall. If you want to find trouble during a heat wave, you do not have to look very hard. Trouble comes out into the open when the air turns heavy and people lose patience with one another. Riddle Street had more trouble than most places. It was a narrow street tucked between older brick buildings on the east side of the city, the sort of street that never seemed entirely awake or entirely asleep. During the day, it smelled of dust, hot stone, and old newspapers. At night, it smelled of cooking grease, pipe smoke, and secrets. The heat had settled over it like a thick blanket. Windows stood open, curtains hung motionless. Men sat on stoops with their collars unbuttoned and stared at nothing. Women carried paper fans and moved them constantly. The Weather Bureau had promised relief. The Weather Bureau had lied. At 12 minutes past 1 in the morning, a scream cut through the heat. It came from the second floor of number 19 Riddle Street. 3 minutes later, nearly every tenant in the building was awake. 7 minutes later, the police arrived. By 2 o'clock, Detective Arthur Bell stood in a narrow hallway staring at a black umbrella. The umbrella stood open beside the wall. Water dripped steadily from its ribs. Plink, plink, plink. The drops struck warped floorboards and gathered into a dark puddle. Bell looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked through the open front doorway. The street outside shimmered beneath gaslight. Dry. Very dry. The nearest rainstorm was probably halfway to another state, yet here stood a wet umbrella. "Well," Bell said quietly, "that's unpleasant." A patrolman beside him blinked. "The body, sir?" "No, the umbrella." The patrolman stared. Bell ignored him. Arthur Bell was 38 years old, lean, careful, and possessed of a face that appeared perpetually skeptical. He had solved enough murders to know that obvious things usually lied. The umbrella was obvious, therefore it interested him. Behind him, uniformed officers moved in and out of a rented room where the victim lay. A woman approached nervously. She was stout, grey-haired, and wore a dressing gown covered with faded flowers. "Detective?" Bell turned. "You are Mrs. Lorne?" "Yes." She glanced toward the room. "Oh dear. You're the landlady?" "Yes." Bell nodded toward the umbrella. "Who owns that?" "I don't know." "You've never seen it before?" "No." "You are certain?" "Absolutely." Bell examined her face. People often lied. Mrs. Lorne appeared genuinely bewildered. "When did you first see it?" he asked. "After the scream." "Whose scream?" "Miss Parker's." Bell made a note. "And the umbrella wasn't here earlier?" "No." "What time did you last pass through this hall?" "Mrs." Lorne thought. "A little before midnight." "And then?" There was nothing there. Bell looked again at the umbrella. The water continued dripping. Plink, plink, plink. He crouched beside the puddle. The patrolman watched with concern. Bell dipped a finger into the water. Then he smelled it. His eyebrows rose. Interesting, very interesting. He smelled it again. There could be no mistake. The water carried a faint fragrance, not strong, not recent, but unmistakable. Roses. Bell straightened. "What is it, sir?" the patrolman asked. Bell looked at him. "Either somebody watered this umbrella with perfume, or our murderer has peculiar habits." The patrolman blinked twice. Bell walked toward the victim's room. Inside, chaos had already begun settling into order. The dead man lay beside a writing desk. His name was Jonah Vale, age 43. Occupation uncertain, residence temporary, cause of death not yet official. But anyone with eyes could make a reasonable guess. A deep wound crossed his throat. The carpet beneath him was dark with blood. Dr. Harris, the medical examiner, stood nearby. Bell entered. "Good evening." The doctor snorted. It was a good evening until somebody murdered a tenant. Bell glanced down. "How long dead?" "Perhaps an hour." "Perhaps?" "Perhaps." Bell sighed. Doctors loved uncertainty almost as much as detectives hated it. The room was small: a bed, a desk, a wardrobe, a chair, a bookshelf containing exactly 7 books. Nothing appeared disturbed, no sign of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, no desperate final movement. It looked less like a murder scene than an unpleasant interruption. Bell studied the victim. Jonah Vale had been thin, dark-haired, neatly dressed. One hand still rested near the desk. Something about that hand bothered Bell. He moved closer. There was ink on the fingertips. Fresh ink. He turned toward the desk. A sheet of paper lay there. Blank, almost blank. At the bottom appeared a short line, 3 words, not a sentence, not a message, simply 3 words written in hurried script. Black umbrella. Hall. Bell stared, then looked toward the doorway, toward the umbrella outside. The doctor noticed. "What?" Bell pointed. The doctor followed his gaze. "Coincidence?" Bell smiled faintly. "No." "Good. Why?" The doctor shrugged. "I dislike coincidences. So do murder victims." The doctor laughed once. Bell continued examining the room. A wallet remained untouched. Money remained inside. A watch remained on the victim's wrist. Nothing appeared stolen, which meant one of 2 things. Either robbery was not the motive, or someone wanted it to appear that robbery was not the motive. Murderers enjoyed creativity. Bell preferred facts. A young woman appeared at the door. She looked pale and frightened. Mrs. Lorne followed behind her. "This is Miss Parker." Bell nodded. "The one who screamed?" The young woman swallowed. "Yes." "What did you see?" She pointed shakily toward the body. "Him." Bell waited. People frequently continued talking if allowed silence. Miss Parker did exactly that. "I heard footsteps." "When?" "Shortly after 1. "Whose footsteps?" "I don't know." "Male?" "Maybe." "Female?" "Maybe." Bell resisted the urge to sigh. Witnesses were wonderful creatures. They observed everything except useful details. What happened next? I opened my door. And? I saw someone at the far end of the hall. Bell's attention sharpened. Someone? Yes. Who? I couldn't tell. Tall? I think so. Man? I think so. Face? No. Why not? The light was off. Bell frowned. There was no light? No. The hall lamp wasn't working. It was. Then why was it dark? Miss Parker hesitated. Someone switched it off. The hallway fell silent. Bell considered that. Interesting, very interesting. Someone had turned off the hall light, yet somehow entered carrying a dripping umbrella, then left. Then Jonah Vale ended up dead. Bell asked quietly, "Did you hear anything else?" She nodded. "Yes." "What?" "A smell." Bell blinked. "A smell?" "Roses." The detective became very still. The medical examiner looked up. Mrs. Lorne crossed herself nervously. Miss Parker continued, "It sounds foolish." "It often does." The whole hall smelled like roses. Bell glanced toward the umbrella again. Now the pieces began arranging themselves, not fitting, not yet, but arranging. A smell. A wet umbrella. A dry city. A dead tenant, and a note mentioning the umbrella before anyone officially noticed it. The victim had seen something. The victim had written something. Then the victim had died. Bell moved toward the window. Outside, Riddle Street stretched beneath the heat, silent, waiting. The detective looked down at the people gathering below. Faces tilted upward, curious, fearful, interested. Murder attracted attention the way lanterns attracted moths. A patrolman entered. "Sir." Bell turned. "What is it?" "We found something downstairs." "Show me." They returned to the hallway. The umbrella still stood beside the wall, dripping, watching. At least that was how it felt. The patrolman held out a small object. Bell examined it. A rose petal, dark red, wet, very fresh, found beneath the umbrella. Bell took it carefully. The petal should not have been there. Nothing about the night suggested roses. Nothing about the building suggested roses. Nothing except the water. The scent, the petal, the witness statement, and the victim's final words. Black umbrella. Hall. The detective looked down the corridor. Something was wrong. Not merely wrong, deliberately wrong. Someone wanted attention directed toward the umbrella. Or someone had failed to remove it. Either possibility was dangerous. Bell turned toward Mrs. Lorne. Tell me about Jonah Vale. She looked uncomfortable. I didn't know him well. Try. He rented the room 3 months ago. Occupation? He never said. Visitors? Occasionally. Men or women? Both. Belle nodded. Anyone recently? Mrs. Lorne thought. Yesterday. Who? A gentleman. What gentleman? I don't know. Description? Tall, grey suit, brown hat. Belle made another note. The list was growing. The answers were not, which was normal for a murder investigation. Questions reproduced faster than rabbits, answers reproduced slower than turtles. He returned to the victim's room. Something still bothered him. The desk, the blank paper, the ink, the position of the body. He sat carefully in the chair, exactly where Jonah Vale had been sitting. Then he looked around. The room changed immediately. That often happened. A room looked different from the victim's chair. Different angles, different sightlines, different truths. From the chair he could see directly into the hallway, directly toward the umbrella. Belle's eyes narrowed. The victim had been facing the hall. The victim had seen the umbrella, then written those 3 words, which meant the umbrella arrived before death. Not after. That mattered. A great deal. He stood. Then he noticed something else. A faint mark on the floor beside the desk. A small wet footprint. Not enough for identification, not enough for size, just enough to exist. Belle followed it. Another mark. Then another. Then nothing. The trail vanished. The detective smiled slightly. Murders often began with blood. This one appeared to begin with water. Outside, dawn remained several hours away. Inside number 19 Riddle Street, the heat lingered. So did the smell of roses. Belle returned to the hallway one final time. The umbrella waited where it had been found. Silent, wet, impossible. He studied it for nearly a minute. Then he spoke quietly, mostly to himself. People kill for money. No answer. They kill for revenge. Still no answer. They kill for fear. The umbrella continued dripping. Plink, plink, plink. Belle looked toward the victim's room, then toward the stairs, then toward the rose-scented water spreading across the floorboards. Finally, he nodded. The case had begun, and somewhere in the heat-soaked darkness of Riddle Street, a murderer was probably feeling very pleased. That feeling would not last because Belle had already noticed the one thing everyone else had ignored. The water beneath the umbrella smelled faintly of roses, and in murder, small things rarely stay small for long. Chapter 2. A House Too Hot for Secrets by Morning. Number 19 Riddle Street smelled of boiled coffee, warm dust, police tobacco, and fear. Fear has a smell if enough people are packed into a narrow house with one dead man upstairs and one impossible umbrella in the hall. It does not smell noble. It smells like damp collars, closed mouths, and lies waiting their turn. Detective Arthur Bell stood in the front parlor, while Mrs. Lorne, the landlady, sat stiffly on a horsehair chair and twisted a handkerchief into a shape that had never existed in nature. Her name, Bell had corrected from the first confusion, was not Weller. It was Lorne. The patrolman had heard wrong in the heat and panic, and Mrs. Lorne had been too shaken to argue with a uniform. I told you, she said. I knew nothing about that umbrella. Bell looked at her. Did not ask about the umbrella. You were going to. That is different. Mrs. Lorne pressed her lips. Together, the boarding house held 6 tenants, besides the late Jonah Vale, and by 9 o'clock, Bell had learned 2 important things. First, all 6 claimed to have been asleep. Second, not one of them looked rested. Jonah Vale had not been liked. That was putting it gently. He had been a collector, but not of stamps, coins, or paintings. Vale collected other people's mistakes. A letter written in anger. A debt hidden from a wife. A theft too small for prison but large enough for shame. He collected them quietly, priced them carefully, and sold silence by the week. A nasty trade, Bell said. Mrs. Lorne looked away. He owed me rent. How much? 3 weeks. And you let him stay. He said he would pay. With money. She did not answer. Bell smiled without warmth. With silence, perhaps. Her face changed. There are many kinds of confession. Words are only the most careless kind. What did he know about you, Mrs. Lorne? Nothing. Then why are you frightened? I am not frightened. You have destroyed that handkerchief. She looked down and stopped twisting it. Belle let the silence settle. At last she whispered, My husband was not dead when I first took boarders. Belle waited. He had gone away. I said he was dead because it was simpler. Vale found a letter and asked for money every Thursday. How much? $2. Enough to hate him? Her eyes flashed. Enough to despise him. Not enough to cut his throat. Belle made a note. That distinction may become useful. The next tenant was Simon Bragg, a thin clerk with nervous hands and the kind of collar that looked offended by the neck inside it. He worked at a shipping office and had the habit of blinking before every answer, as if each truth required permission. You knew Vale? Belle asked. I lived under the same roof. That was not my question, Bragg swallowed. Yes, you disliked him. I had cause. Tell me the cause. The clerk looked toward the window. Outside, the street shimmered under the same pitiless sun. The city had not cooled during the night. It had merely stopped pretending. I was engaged, Bragg said. To Ellen Marsh. Was. She broke it off because of Vale? Bragg's jaw tightened. He sent her a copy of a receipt. For what? For money I had taken from the office. Belle studied him. Stolen? Borrowed? Without permission? Bragg said nothing. That word has sharp teeth, Mr. Bragg. I paid it back, but Vale knew, yes, and sold the knowledge. Bragg's hands closed. He ruined me. And he never stopped reminding me about Clara Denton and the storm. No, Belle said mildly. You began the work. Vale charged admission. The clerk flinched. Belle did not apologize. Sympathy was useful in grief, dangerous in murder. Where were you last night shortly after 1? In my room. Alone? Yes. Can anyone prove it? No. Did you hear footsteps? No. Smell roses? Bragg looked up too fast. Belle noticed. I smelled nothing. I did not say you had. I mean, no, nothing. Belle wrote that down too. By noon, the house had begun to reveal its shape. Not its truth, but its shape. On the top floor lived Miss Ada Pike, a sewing woman with a bad cough and sharper eyes than she needed. Vale had possessed a letter from a married customer to her, written too warmly and paid for too coldly. Across from her lived Mr. Caleb Moss, a retired stage manager, who claimed Vale had stolen a silver watch and then threatened to accuse Moss of theft if he complained. In the back room lived Nora Finch, a music teacher whose brother had once forged her name on a loan paper. Vale had found the document. The sixth tenant was Harold Venn, a traveling salesman who was not traveling and sold very little. He said Vale meant nothing to him, which immediately made Belle suspicious. People who say a dead blackmailer meant nothing usually mean he meant too much. Belle questioned them one by one in the parlor while the heat pressed against the windows and the dead man waited upstairs for the city to finish with him. They all denied owning the umbrella. They all denied visiting Vale. They all denied turning off the hall lamp. They all denied smelling roses except Miss Parker, whose room faced the hall and whose scream had opened the night. Miss Parker was not a tenant of consequence at first glance. She was young, plain, and frightened in a manner that suggested practice. Her hands trembled when she spoke, but her eyes did not wander. That made Belle listen. You saw a figure, he said. At the far end of the hall. Near Vale's door? Yes. Before or after you saw the umbrella? Before. Belle's pencil stopped. You are sure? She nodded. When I opened my door, the hall was dark. I saw someone move. Then I heard a soft sound like cloth shaking. Then the lamp came on again, by itself. No, someone must have turned it on. Who? I don't know. I shut my door. I was frightened. And then I smelled roses. And after that, a few minutes later, I heard something fall in Mr. Vale's room. Then I screamed. Belle leaned back. That order mattered. Movement, darkness, cloth shaking, rose smell, falling sound, scream. Did the figure come from the stairs? No. From Vale's room? She hesitated. I think from the back. Belle looked toward the rear of the house, the back passage. Yes. Mrs. Lorne had insisted earlier that no visitor could enter without using the front door. Landladies often believe houses obey them. Houses rarely do. Belle went to the back of the building. There he found a narrow service passage leading past the kitchen, ending at a door that opened into a small yard, boxed in by brick walls. The yard contained ash bins, a cracked basin, and a wooden gate that led to an alley. The gate was bolted from inside. The bolt was old. The scrape mark beneath it was... Bell crouched. There was mud on the lower board, not much, a smear, a dark streak. He touched it carefully. Damp in a city without rain for 12 days. He stood and looked at the kitchen maid, who had been watching from the doorway. "What is your name?" "Elsie." "Did you wash the yard last night?" "No, sir." "Did anyone?" "No, sir." "Do roses grow nearby?" She laughed before she remembered there was a corpse upstairs. "On Riddle Street." "A fair answer." Bell examined the gate. A person could enter from the alley, lift the bolt with a thin blade through the gap, step into the yard, pass through the service door, and reach the back passage. From there, with the hall lamp turned off, he could stand near Vale's room. Unseen, or she, Bell disliked careless pronouns in murder. He returned inside. Mrs. Lorne was waiting. "No one uses that gate," she said. Quickly, "I had not yet accused anyone of doing so. It sticks. It has recently been persuaded." Her face paled. Bell pointed toward the hall. "Who had a key to the back door?" "I keep it." "Where?" "In the kitchen drawer." "Locked?" "No." "Then everyone had it." She said nothing. Bell went upstairs again. The umbrella had been removed by the police, but its wet mark remained. The floorboards were stained darker where the puddle had spread. Even now, in the afternoon heat, the scent of roses lingered faintly. Bell entered Vale's room. The body had been taken away. Without it, the room looked smaller and more dishonest. He sat again at the desk. From there he could see the hallway. He imagined Vale seated here after midnight, perhaps writing, perhaps waiting. A black umbrella appears in the hall. Impossible. Wet, dripping, scented with roses. Would Vale have risen? Perhaps, but he had not died in the hall. He had died beside the desk. So either he recognized the umbrella and stayed where he was, or the umbrella was a signal meant to bring someone else. Bell examined the blank paper again. The 3 words remained. Black umbrella, hall, not killer, not help, not a name. Why write that? Because he knew the umbrella mattered, but had not yet understood how. Bell opened the desk drawers. The first contained paper, envelopes and 2 cheap pens. The second contained bills. The third was locked. That was helpful. Locked drawers are little sermons preached by guilty. Furniture. The key was not in the room. Bell sent for a constable with tools. The drawer opened 5 minutes later. Inside lay a neat packet of envelopes tied with string. A blackmailer's garden. Bell untied it. Names. Appeared Lorne. Bragged, Pike, Moss, Finch, Venn, all 6 tenants. All 6 had reason. All 6 had paid. At the bottom of the drawer was a smaller envelope, marked only with a single word, roses. Bell opened it. Inside was a dried rose petal, a pawn ticket, and a torn scrap of paper with a line written in Vale's hand. Paid once. Will pay again when she comes through the back. Bell read it twice, then a third time. She, he said softly. That did not clear the men. Men had been known to arrange grammar for their own convenience, but it changed the air in the room. He placed the items on the desk. A visitor had come before death. The visitor had not used the front door. The visitor was connected to roses. The visitor was expected, and Jonah Vale, collector of other people's mistakes, had known enough to write about the umbrella, but not enough to survive it. Bell went to the window and looked down into the yard. The alley beyond was narrow, shaded and sour with refuse. Anyone could pass there unseen after midnight. Anyone could enter through the gate if prepared. He turned as Simon Bragg appeared in the doorway. The clerk looked ill. "I heard you found his papers." "You heard quickly. This house has thin walls and thick secrets." Bragg looked at the floor. "Did he keep mine?" "Yes." The clerk closed his eyes. "Then it is over?" "For your engagement, perhaps. For murder, no. I did not kill him." "Most people say that before they are asked." Bragg looked up, desperate. "You must believe me. I must do nothing of the kind." The clerk took 1 step forward. "I saw someone." Bell's gaze sharpened. "When?" "Last night." "Where?" "In the alley." "What time?" "Near midnight." "Why were you in the alley?" Bragg hesitated. Bell waited. The clerk broke. "I went out to meet Ellen. The broken engagement still has meetings. She wanted her letters back from Vale. I told her I would try." "Did you?" No, I lost courage. Whom did you see? A woman. Describe her. She wore a dark dress, a veil. She carried something long wrapped in cloth. An umbrella? I don't know. Did she enter the gate? I think so. You think? I heard the gate scrape. Belle's face remained calm inside the case moved. Why did you not say this before? Because I should not have been there. Naturally. Innocent people are often busy hiding innocent things. Bragg flushed. Belle dismissed him and stood alone in the dead man's room. A veiled woman, a wrapped object, a back gate, rose-scented water, an umbrella that should not be wet. The house was too hot for secrets. They were beginning to sweat out through the walls. But Belle knew better than to be pleased. Early evidence is like a talkative drunk. It tells you many things, and half of them are lies. He returned to the hall and looked at the dark stain where the umbrella had stood. The murderer had brought water into a dry house. Not ordinary water, rose water. Why, to mark the umbrella, to send a message, to hide another smell? Belle's eyes narrowed. That last thought stayed with him. Rose water could perfume a hall. It could also cover something. He went back to Vale's desk and lifted the dead man's ink-stained paper. Beneath it, on the wood, was a small crescent scratch, fresh, as if something curved and sharp had rested there. A blade? A hook? The medical examiner had said the throat wound was deep and clean, not made by a kitchen knife in panic, made by a sharp tool used with purpose. Belle looked again at the window, then at the hall, then at the desk. The murder had not been a simple visit and quarrel. It had been arranged. The umbrella was not foolish. It was theatre, and theatre always needed an audience. Jonah Vale had been the first audience. The tenants were the second. Arthur Bell, the murderer hoped, would be the third. Bell smiled faintly. That was a mistake. He left the room and found Mrs. Lorne standing by the stairs. Detective? Yes? Will this ruin my house? Bell looked around at the narrow walls, the sweating paper, the frightened faces listening behind doors. No, he said. Your house was already ruined. This may merely make it honest. She stared at him. He walked past her and descended toward the back passage, where the new scrape on the gate waited in the heat. Behind him, in the dead man's room, the drawer of secrets sat open. And somewhere among 6 tenants, 1 visitor, 1 rose-scented umbrella and 1 missing explanation, Jonah Vale's murderer had made the first mistake, not by killing him. Chapter 3. The Dry Footprints detective Arthur Bell had spent enough years investigating murders to learn one reliable rule. When evidence seemed impossible, it usually meant somebody had worked very hard to make it look that way. The black umbrella was impossible. Therefore, someone had worked very hard. The heat wave continued into its second week. By Wednesday morning, the city looked exhausted. The sidewalks shimmered. The rooftops seemed to sweat. Even the pigeons moved with reluctance. Number 19. Riddle Street felt worse. A murder hanging over a boarding house is like smoke trapped beneath a ceiling. It reaches every room eventually. The tenants whispered. The landlady worried. The police came and went, and the stain left by the umbrella remained visible in the hallway. Bell stood over it again shortly after 8 o'clock. The umbrella itself sat downtown in a police evidence room. But the floor remembered. The dark mark spread across several warped boards near Jonah Vale's door. A constable approached. "Morning, sir." Bell nodded. "Have the photographs arrived?" "Yes." The constable handed them over. Bell examined them carefully. The photographs had been taken immediately after the umbrella was discovered. At first glance, they showed nothing new. At second glance, they showed everything. Bell smiled faintly. That was encouraging. The constable noticed. Something useful. Possibly. Looks like water. It does. The constable waited. Bell enjoyed making young officers think. He pointed. "What do you see?" "A puddle." "What else?" "Drops." "Good." The constable frowned. Bell continued. "Where are the footprints?" The young officer blinked. "What footprints?" "Exactly." The constable looked again, then again. Slowly his expression changed. There were drops of water. Many drops. The umbrella had clearly dripped, but nobody had walked through the water. No wet tracks entered the hallway. No wet tracks left it. No footprints led from the front door. No footprints led toward the stairs. Nothing. The hallway contained water without movement, which was nonsense. Water creates stories. It follows shoes. It marks paths. It tattles. This water had remained suspiciously silent. Bell folded the photographs. "People notice what exists," he said. "Yes, sir. I prefer noticing what should exist and doesn't." The constable considered that. Bell walked slowly along the corridor. The floorboards creaked beneath his shoes. He stopped near the stain and crouched. Several droplets formed a rough pattern, not random, not entirely. He took out a measuring tape. The constable stared. Bell ignored him. 10 minutes later, he had measured every visible mark remaining on the floor. 20 minutes later, he had sketched them in a notebook. 30 minutes later, he was smiling again. The constable grew nervous whenever Bell smiled. Experience had taught him that smiles generally meant work. "What is it, sir?" Bell stood. "The drops don't come from the front door." The constable frowned. "They don't?" "No." "Then where do they come from?" Bell pointed. "Not toward the street entrance, toward the far end of the hall, toward a narrow door beneath the stairs. The cellar entrance." The constable stared. "But that makes no sense. Most murders begin there." They crossed the hallway. Bell opened the cellar door. A wave of cooler air drifted upward. Not cool, merely less hot. The difference felt luxurious. The detective descended carefully. The cellar was low-ceilinged and crowded. Coal bins occupied one wall. Old furniture occupied another. Boxes, trunks, broken chairs, and forgotten household objects filled the shadows. Dust covered everything, almost everything. Bell paused halfway down the stairs. The floor below contained marks, recent marks. Someone had moved through the cellar within the last 24 hours. The dust revealed enough to prove it, not footprints, something dragged, something carried, something heavy enough to disturb the dust, yet light enough not to leave clear impressions. Bell continued downward. The constable followed. "What are we looking for?" "I don't know yet." "Then how will we know when we find it?" Bell glanced back. "That is what separates detectives from tourists." The constable sighed. The cellar smelled of damp wood and old stone. Beneath that lingered another odor. Faint, pleasant, unexpected. Bell stopped. There it was again, the scent of roses. Very faint, but unmistakable. The detective moved toward the rear corner. Several wooden crates stood stacked beside an unused water barrel. Behind them, he discovered the first interesting object, a broken flower stem. Then another, then 3 more. The stems appeared freshly cut, not dried, not old. Bell crouched. The stems had belonged to roses. Someone had removed the blossoms. The constable stared. Roses, yes. From the umbrella? Perhaps. Bell searched the surrounding area. A few feet away, he found a damp cloth. The fabric remained slightly wet despite the heat. He lifted it carefully. The scent hit immediately. Rose fragrance, strong, artificial, not perfume. Something cheaper, something bottled. Bell looked around. A minute later, he found the bottle itself. It lay behind a crate where somebody had attempted to hide it. The label remained intact. Rose Hair Tonic, half empty. The detective examined it, then the cloth, then the flower stems. The picture sharpened. Not completely, but enough. The constable spoke first. "Somebody spilled it?" "No." "You think it was used deliberately?" "Very deliberately." Bell unscrewed the bottle cap. The fragrance matched perfectly. The same scent, the same odor lingering in the hallway. The same smell Miss Parker had noticed. The same smell mixed with the water beneath the umbrella. The detective smiled. This time the smile contained satisfaction. The impossible umbrella had become considerably less impossible. He climbed back upstairs carrying the evidence. Mrs. Lorne intercepted him near the kitchen. "Did you find something?" "Several things." "About Mr. Vale?" "About the umbrella." The landlady blinked. "The umbrella?" "Yes." Her expression suggested disappointment. Like many people, she preferred murder to plumbing. Bell placed the bottle on the kitchen table. Mrs. Lorne stared. "Hair tonic?" "Rose hair tonic." What about it? Belle explained. The broken stems. The damp cloth, the cellar, the fragrance. The landlady listened. When he finished, she frowned. That still doesn't explain why the umbrella was wet. Belle tapped the bottle. It explains part of it. Only part? Most explanations arrive in pieces. Mrs. Lorne sighed. The detective returned upstairs. The hallway looked different now, not mysterious, constructed, artificial, a stage set. Someone had wanted observers to believe the umbrella had come from outside. That assumption created an image. Rain, a visitor, a stranger arriving from the street. But there had been no rain, and now Belle possessed something better than suspicion. He possessed geometry. The measured droplets told their own story. The water trail did not lead inward from the front entrance. It led outward from the cellar. The pattern was unmistakable once examined properly. The umbrella had been carried upstairs from below, not brought into the building from outside. Belle stood where the umbrella had stood. Then he imagined the sequence. A person enters the cellar. The umbrella becomes wet. Rose tonic is added to the water. The umbrella is carried upstairs. The hallway light is extinguished. The umbrella is opened and positioned. The killer waits, but waits for what? That remained the question. Their voice interrupted his thoughts. Detective Simon Bragg stood halfway down the corridor. Belle turned, yes? The clerk looked nervous, more nervous than usual, which was impressive. I remembered something. Belle waited. About Mr. Vale. Go on. 2 weeks ago, he received flowers. Belle's interest sharpened immediately. What kind? Roses. From whom? I don't know. A card? I never saw one. How many roses? A large bouquet. Belle considered that. What happened to them? Bragg shrugged. He threw them away. Immediately. No. When? The next day. Why? I don't know. Belle doubted that. People always knew more than they admitted. The detective moved closer. Mr. Bragg. Yes? Did Mr. Vale seem pleased by the flowers? The clerk hesitated. No. Why not? He seemed frightened. Belle became very still. That answer mattered, perhaps more than Bragg realized. Frightened. Yes. Certain. Very. The clerk swallowed. I heard him arguing with someone. When? The day the flowers arrived. Who? I couldn't tell. A man? I think a woman. The detective's eyes narrowed. The woman again. The mysterious visitor mentioned in Vale's note. The person expected through the back entrance. The possible figure seen in the alley. The puzzle pieces continued drifting together. Not fitting. Not yet. But drifting. Belle thanked Bragg and returned to the victim's room. The locked drawer contents remained spread across the desk. He examined the envelope marked roses once more. The dried petal, the pawn ticket, the note. Paid once. Will pay again when she comes through the back. He read it slowly, then again. Something bothered him. Not the meaning, the wording. Vale had not written when she returns, or when she arrives. Instead, he had written when she comes through the back. Specific. Very specific, as if the route mattered. Belle walked to the window. Outside, sunlight blazed across the yard. The alley beyond remained hidden. The back entrance, the cellar, the umbrella, the roses, a chain. Not complete, but a chain. By late afternoon, the laboratory report arrived. The detective read it carefully, then smiled for a third time. The water collected from beneath the umbrella contained no rainwater residue whatsoever. Instead, it consisted primarily of ordinary tap water mixed with traces of rose hair tonic, exactly as Belle had suspected. The umbrella had never been outside during a storm. It had been soaked deliberately, inside the house. The impossible mystery vanished. In its place appeared something more interesting, intent, because nobody wets an umbrella indoors without a reason. Belle sat at Vale's desk and stared toward the hallway. The dead man had seen the umbrella, recognized its significance, written those final words. Black umbrella. Hall. Not because the umbrella was strange, because it meant something. It was a message, or a signal, or a warning. The detective leaned back. The ceiling fan rotated lazily overhead. The heat remained unbearable, yet a chill touched the edges of the case. Someone had created a false rainstorm inside a boarding house. Someone had scented it with roses. Someone had wanted attention fixed on an umbrella. And somewhere among 6 tenants and 1 unidentified visitor, a murderer knew exactly why. Arthur Bell looked once more toward the cellar door at the end of the corridor. The water trail had betrayed the truth. The umbrella had not arrived from the street. It had risen from below, and murder, Bell reflected, often worked the same way. The visible story came from above. The real one waited in the cellar. Chapter 4. The Man Who Sold Silence. By Thursday morning, Detective Arthur Bell had reached a conclusion that would have surprised no one who had ever met Jonah Vail. The dead man had been even less popular than he appeared. A blackmailer creates enemies the way a tree creates leaves. Most are small, some are poisonous, a few are deadly. The difficulty lies in determining which branch finally breaks. The heat continued without mercy. The city newspapers devoted entire columns to predictions of relief, while simultaneously reporting cases of heat exhaustion. Neither activity cooled anybody. At number 19 Riddle Street, the atmosphere had become worse than the weather. The tenants watched one another. Doors opened slightly when footsteps approached. Conversations stopped when Bell entered a room. The murder had transformed the boarding house into a collection of separate islands connected only by suspicion. Bell preferred facts. Unfortunately, facts were proving shy. He spent the morning once again in Jonah Vail's room. The room had been searched thoroughly by uniformed officers, then searched again by detectives, then searched a third time because experience had taught Bell that most searches missed exactly the thing they sought. The third search proved useful. It usually did. The detective stood before the narrow bookshelf near the window. 7 books occupied the shelves: a dictionary, 2 travel guides, a history of shipping, 3 novels, and an account ledger. The ledger looked ordinary. That alone made it suspicious. Bell removed it. The book felt heavier than it should. He opened it. The pages had been hollowed out. Inside rested a small black notebook. Bell smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Vail." The dead man remained silent. Bell sat at the desk and opened the notebook carefully. The first page contained only initials. The second page contained dates. The third page explained everything. Not openly, not completely, but enough. Jonah Vail had maintained records, meticulous records. The notebook contained dozens of entries, initials. Amounts, descriptions, payments, threats, scandals, mistakes. Shame reduced to bookkeeping. Bell turned pages slowly. .lb, husband missing, weekly, AP, letters returned, settled, CM, theatre account, ongoing.nf, loan document, monthly. Every tenant appeared somewhere. Every weakness had a price. Every price had been collected. The detective continued reading. Vail had organized lives the way bankers organized accounts. A cold, efficient system. No emotion, no guilt, just profit. Bell reached another page, then stopped. One entry had been underlined twice: SB, summer umbrella, payment due. The detective stared, then read it again. SB Simon Bragg, summer umbrella, payment due. Interesting. Very interesting. Bell closed the notebook and went downstairs. He found Simon Bragg sitting alone in the parlor. The clerk looked exhausted. People often do after becoming more important to a murder investigation. Mr. Bragg. The clerk looked up nervously. Detective. Bell sat opposite him. "I found something." Bragg swallowed. "About me?" "Possibly." The detective removed the notebook. The clerk's face lost color. Recognition, fear, memory, 3 useful reactions appearing simultaneously. Bell showed him the entry, SB, summer umbrella, payment due. Bragg stared, then blinked, then laughed unexpectedly. The sound surprised both of them. "You think that means me?" "It might. It doesn't." Bell waited. The clerk shook his head. "I haven't seen that notebook before." "But you understand the entry?" "Yes." "What does it mean?" Bragg hesitated, then sighed. "I suppose it doesn't matter now." It often matters more after murder. The clerk nodded. The umbrella wasn't mine. Bell leaned forward. Go on. 3 years ago, I worked for another firm. Which firm? Morton and Blackwell. Bell noticed the name immediately. A respected company. Large, profitable, connected. Continue. The owner lost an umbrella. Bell blinked. A lost umbrella. It sounds ridiculous. Many murders begin that way. Bragg smiled weakly. The umbrella contained papers. What papers? Contracts. Important? Very. Bell remained silent. The clerk continued. The loss caused problems. You were blamed? Yes. Were you responsible? No. But Vale learned about it. Eventually. And blackmailed you. Exactly. Bell sat back. The explanation fit. Too easily. That worried him. Truth usually limped, lies marched. Then why write summer umbrella? Bell asked. Bragg shrugged. That was how Vale remembered things. Perhaps. Perhaps not. The detective studied him carefully. The clerk appeared frightened, embarrassed, defeated but not murderous. Bell had learned not to trust impressions. Still, impressions mattered. Did Vale threaten you recently? Every month? Last week? Yes. Last night? No. The answer arrived too quickly, Bell noticed. So did Bragg. The clerk looked away. You're lying. No. Mr. Bragg. Silence. Mr. Bragg. More silence. Finally, the clerk surrendered. He sent a note. When? Yesterday morning. What note? Bragg retrieved a folded paper from his pocket. Bell opened it. The message was short. Come tonight, final warning, JV. The detective folded it again. Why didn't you show me this earlier? I was afraid. Of what? Being arrested. Bell almost smiled. Innocent people fear arrest. Bragg looked hopeful. Guilty people fear conviction. The hope vanished. Bell stood. Did you visit him? No. Can anyone prove that? No. Unfortunate. The clerk closed his eyes. The detective left him there. The notebook had clarified some matters. It had complicated others. Which was normal. Complications were evidence working hard. Bell returned upstairs. The victim's room felt increasingly crowded, despite being empty. Every new discovery seemed to add another invisible occupant. The detective resumed searching. This time, he concentrated on the fireplace. The season made fireplaces absurd. No fire had burned there for months. Yet something bothered him. The ashes appeared disturbed, not recently, carefully. Bell knelt. Using a pencil, he sifted through the grey remains. Several charred fragments emerged. Burned paper. Most were unreadable. One survived, barely a corner, nothing more. The paper quality caught his attention immediately. Expensive. Heavy, the kind used by wealthy people who liked their correspondence to announce its own importance. Bell examined the fragment. A single letter remained visible. Nothing else, just one black printed letter. The detective turned it over, blank. He sat back thoughtfully. The notebook suggested ordinary blackmail. The stationery suggested something larger. People in boarding houses rarely ordered paper of that quality. People in large houses often did. The difference mattered. Bell placed the fragment into an evidence envelope. Then he looked around the room again. Something had changed. Not physically, mentally. The case had shifted. Until now, every clue pointed inward. Toward the tenants. Toward the boarding house. Toward small secrets and small payments. The burned stationery pointed outward. Toward money. Toward influence. Toward someone wealthier than the residents of Riddle Street. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Miss Parker stood in the doorway. You wanted to see me? Yes. She entered cautiously. The young woman looked tired. The entire house looked tired. Bell suspected nobody was sleeping well. Were you acquainted with Mr. Vale? Not really. You paid him? Her eyes widened. No. Never. No. Bell believed her. That did not make her innocent, only different. Did he receive visitors often? Sometimes. Any wealthy visitors? Miss Parker hesitated. One. Bell became attentive. Describe him. I never saw him clearly. Try. He wore expensive clothes. That narrows New York to several thousand people. A faint smile appeared, then vanished. He arrived in a motor car. Better, much better. Most residents of Riddle Street arrived on foot. How many times? Twice. When? About a month ago. Bell nodded. What happened? They argued. How do you know? I heard them. What about? I couldn't hear the words, only the tone. Yes, Bell considered that. A wealthy visitor. Arguments. Burned stationery. The letter M, the notebook. The case continued expanding, like a crack spreading through glass. Later that afternoon, Bell visited several businesses near the street. People remembered Jonah Vale. Not fondly. A tobacconist described him as a man who listened too much. A grocer described him as a man who asked too many questions. The bartender described him as a man who paid promptly. That last detail surprised Bell. Blackmail apparently remained profitable. The most useful conversation occurred at a florist shop 3 blocks away. The owner remembered Vale immediately. The roses. Bell leaned forward. What roses? Large order. When? About 2 weeks ago. The florist checked a notebook. Yes. 24 red roses. Delivered to Vale? No. Then whom? The florist smiled. I don't reveal customer information. Bell displayed his badge. The smile faded. The florist checked again. Actually, they were purchased for Mr. Vale. By whom? The florist hesitated, then pointed. A woman. What woman? I don't know. Description? Dark dress. Bell's pulse quickened slightly. The woman from the alley. The florist blinked. I beg your pardon? Never mind, continue. She paid cash. Did she leave a card? Yes. What did it say? The florist frowned. I don't remember. Bell sighed. Witnesses remembered useless details with extraordinary precision and important details with remarkable forgetfulness. On his way back to the boarding house, another thought occurred. The roses, the tonic, the scent, the mysterious woman, the expected visitor, the wealthy connection. Perhaps they were not separate clues. Perhaps they were the same clue wearing different hats. The detective returned to number 19 shortly before evening. Mrs. Lorne met him at the door. You look pleased. I am thinking. That's the same thing? Sometimes. She glanced toward the staircase. Will you catch whoever did it? Bell considered. Yes. The confidence surprised her. Already? No. Then how can you know? The detective removed the notebook from his pocket. Because Mr. Vale made the same mistake many blackmailers make. What mistake? He believed information was power. Mrs. Lorne frowned, isn't it? Only until someone has more. Bell climbed the stairs. The hallway remained quiet. The stain where the umbrella had stood seemed darker in the fading light. He paused beside it. A black umbrella, a false rainstorm, rose-scented water. A mysterious woman, a wealthy visitor, a burned letter bearing only M, and a notebook proving Jonah Vale had spent years selling silence. The detective looked toward the victim's room, someone richer. That was Simon Bragg's phrase. Not a denial, not an accusation. A direction. Perhaps Bragg had lied about many things. Perhaps he had lied about none. But Bell suspected one statement was true. Jonah Vale had been threatening someone wealthier than a frightened clerk, someone who could afford expensive stationery. Someone connected to roses, someone important enough to make murder seem preferable to payment. The detective opened the door to Vale's room once more. The shadows stretched across the floorboards. The desk sat waiting. The notebook lay where he had left it. And among the dead man's records, Arthur Bell felt certain one answer remained hidden. The problem was that answers, like murderers, rarely introduced themselves. They preferred to be discovered. Chapter 5. The Lady in the Cool Gloves, The Heat Wave. Entered its 14th day and achieved something Arthur Bell had previously considered impossible. It made New Yorkers discuss the weather more than money. The city baked. Newspapers reported record temperatures. Street vendors poured water over sidewalks that dried almost immediately. Office clerks loosened collars. Policemen searched for shade. Even criminals appeared less energetic. At number 19 Riddle Street, however, the weather had competition. Murder remained the more popular topic. Belle arrived shortly after 10 in the morning and found Mrs. Lorne waiting in the front parlour. The landlady looked troubled. Not unusual. She had looked troubled since Jonah Vale died. Today, however, her concern carried a different flavour. She kept glancing toward the window, toward the street, toward someone outside. "Expecting a visitor?" Belle asked. Mrs. Lorne jumped. "No." "You looked at the window 3 times. I did not. 4 now." The landlady sighed. "You notice everything?" "No, only the useful things." She hesitated, then said, "Mrs. Keene may come." Belle became interested immediately. "Mrs. Keene, Martha Keene." The name meant nothing yet. "Friend of yours?" Mrs. Lorne looked uncomfortable. "Not exactly." "Then why visit?" "She comes occasionally." "Why?" "To talk." "About what?" The landlady spread her hands helplessly. "Everything." Belle had met many people who talked about everything. They almost always came to discuss one thing. He made a note. An hour later, Martha Keene arrived. Belle knew immediately she was important, not because of what she said, because of what she wore. The widow entered carrying a handbag, a parasol, and enough composure for 3 ordinary people. She appeared perhaps 50 years old, elegant, well-dressed, carefully controlled, and completely inappropriate for the weather. The temperature outside hovered near 100 degrees. Mrs. Keene wore gloves, grey gloves, fine gloves, cool gloves. Belle noticed them before she crossed the room. Most people would have removed them immediately. She kept them on. Interesting. Very interesting. Mrs. Lorne introduced them. "Mrs. Keene, this is Detective Belle." The widow inclined her head politely. "Detective. Mrs. Keene." Her voice carried education and money, not excessive money, old money. The difference mattered. Belle sat quietly while the women exchanged pleasantries. Mrs. Keene asked about the heat. Mrs. Lorne complained about the heat. Mrs. Keene expressed sympathy regarding the murder. Mrs. Lorne expressed distress regarding the murder. The conversation resembled a dance performed by people who preferred not to touch. Belle watched. The widow reached into her handbag, removed a handkerchief, touched it briefly to her cheek, then returned it. The motion lasted perhaps 2 seconds. That was enough. Belle smelled roses, not strong, not overwhelming, but unmistakable. Roses. Again. The scent appeared and vanished almost immediately. Mrs. Keene noticed Belle noticing. That was useful. Most guilty people worry about evidence. Many innocent people worry about detectives. The widow folded her hands. The gloves remained on. "Detective," she said pleasantly, "I understand you're investigating Mr. Vale's death. That is generally what detectives do after murders." A brief smile appeared, then disappeared. "You have a reputation." "I hope it is affordable," Mrs. Lorne groaned softly. Belle ignored her. The widow looked toward the window. "Do you believe the killer lived here, do you?" Mrs. Keene paused. "I don't know." The answer arrived carefully, too carefully. Belle leaned back. "How often did you visit this boarding house?" The widow's eyes shifted. "Just slightly enough, I couldn't say. Try, occasionally. Weekly? Sometimes. Monthly? Sometimes. Yesterday? No." The answer arrived too fast. Belle almost smiled. "Interesting. Very interesting. Because people who tell the truth usually remember first and answer second." Mrs. Keene had answered first, then remembered. "Not yesterday?" Belle asked. "No. Certain?" "Yes." Belle nodded, then removed a notebook from his pocket. "That is unfortunate." The widow became still. "Why?" "Because 3 people saw a woman matching your description near this house yesterday." Silence. Mrs. Lorne stared. Belle watched carefully. Mrs. Keene did not panic. She did not protest. She simply calculated. That told him more than panic would have. Finally, she sighed. "Very well." Mrs. Lorne blinked. "What?" The widow removed her gloves. Slowly, carefully. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from age, not from heat, from fear. "I was here." Belle remained silent. People often continue speaking when silence feels uncomfortable. Mrs. Keene did exactly that. I came to see Mr. Vale. Mrs. Lorne gasped. The widow ignored her. Why? Belle asked. Because he was blackmailing me. The room became quiet. Even the heat seemed to pause. Belle nodded. Tell me about it. Mrs. Keene looked down at her hands. My husband owned a shipping company. Belle remembered the name immediately. Keene Shipping, respectable, profitable, connected. Very connected, the widow continued. 10 years ago there were irregularities. What kind? Business records. Fraud? The word hung in the air. She closed her eyes briefly. Yes. Belle waited. My husband altered certain documents. Why? To secure loans? Illegal loans? Technically. Belle made no comment. Technically was often the most dangerous word in the English language. Did anyone discover it? No. Except Jonah Vale. The widow nodded. How? I don't know. Belle believed that part. Blackmailers rarely revealed sources. How long had he known? Nearly 2 years. How much money? Several $100s. Mrs. Lorne looked shocked. To residents of Riddle Street, several $100s resembled a royal treasury. Belle asked quietly, And yesterday? Mrs. Keene looked away. He wanted more. How much? A great deal. Did he threaten exposure? Yes. Did you argue? Yes. Belle nodded. An honest answer. That made him suspicious. Honest answers arriving too easily usually concealed dishonest ones nearby. Did he mention the umbrella? The widow frowned. No. Did he mention roses? No. Another answer. Too quick. Belle filed it away. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. When it ended, Mrs. Keene appeared exhausted. The detective remained unconvinced. Not because she seemed guilty, because she seemed frightened. There is a difference, a large difference. People fear punishment. People fear discovery. People fear scandal. Murderers fear capture. The emotions look similar from a distance. Belle preferred close observation. After the widow left, he remained seated. Mrs. Lorne watched him nervously. Do you think she did it? No. The answer surprised her. Why not? Belle smiled faintly. Because she lies badly. The landlady stared. That proves innocence? No. It sounds backwards. It usually is. Belle stood and crossed toward the window. The street below shimmered beneath the heat. Mrs. Lorne followed. I don't understand. Most guilty people prepare lies. Yes. Innocent people improvise them. The landlady blinked. Belle continued. A guilty person expects questions. Naturally. An innocent person hides embarrassment. Mrs. Lorne frowned. What embarrassment? The kind that has nothing to do with murder. The detective turned. Mrs. Keene lied about being here yesterday. Yes. Then admitted it. Yes. She lied about roses. Yes. She may be lying about other things. Mrs. Lorne crossed her arms. That sounds suspicious. It is. Then why isn't she guilty? Belle smiled. Because every lie she told made her look foolish. The landlady stared. The detective explained patiently. If she murdered Vale, she would hide facts connected to murder. Naturally, instead she hid facts connected to shame. Mrs. Lorne considered. Slowly understanding arrived. Her husband. Exactly. The records. Exactly. The blackmail. Exactly. Belle nodded. She fears disgrace. The landlady looked thoughtful. Not prison. Precisely. That distinction mattered. A great deal. Later that afternoon, Belle visited Mrs. Keene's residence. The house occupied a respectable street, far removed from Riddle Street. The neighborhood contained trees, clean sidewalks, quiet automobiles, and enough money to make a boarding house seem like another country. A maid admitted him. Mrs. Keene received him in a drawing room, cooled by electric fans. The temperature difference felt miraculous. Belle looked around. Expensive furniture, family portraits, taste money order. Nothing resembled Jonah Vale, which perhaps explained the problem. The widow sat opposite him. You came back? Yes. Why? Because you omitted something. She became still. What? The stationery, her eyes widened, only briefly, but enough. Belle removed the burned fragment from an envelope. The letter M remained visible. Nothing more. Mrs. Keene stared, then looked away. "You recognize it?" "No." The lie arrived immediately. Bell sighed inwardly. Another bad lie, another useful one. He placed the fragment on the table. "Mrs. Keene." Silence. "Mrs. Keene." Finally she surrendered. "It looks familiar." "How familiar?" "Very." Bell waited. The widow folded her hands. "Our household stationery carries a decorative letter." "Hem?" "Yes." The detective nodded. The wealthy visitor. The expensive paper. The argument. The blackmail. The pieces moved closer together. Not enough, but closer. "Did you write to Vale?" "No." "Did your husband?" "My husband is dead." "Before his death." The widow hesitated, then answered, "Possibly." Bell believed that answer more than the others, because uncertainty sounded genuine. Did anyone else have access to that stationery? Of course. Who? Employees, family, visitors? Bell nodded. The answer expanded possibilities rather than reducing them. Which was unfortunate. As he rose to leave, another detail caught his attention. A silver frame sat upon a side table. The photograph showed Mrs. Keene and her husband. Beside them stood a younger man, tall, confident, well-dressed. Bell pointed. "Who is that?" The widow followed his gaze. Something changed in her expression. Fear, real fear, not social fear, not embarrassment, something deeper. "My nephew." The detective became very still. "What is his name?" "Miles Keene." Bell's pulse quickened. "Miles." The widow nodded. The detective thought of the burned paper, the single surviving letter. M, perhaps coincidence, perhaps not. He thanked her and left. Outside, the heat struck again like a physical blow. Bell walked slowly toward the city center. His thoughts moved faster. Martha Keene was hiding something. He felt certain of that, but not murder. No, something else, something connected to her husband, to the forged records, to the blackmail, and perhaps to her nephew, Miles Keene. The name lingered. That evening, Bell returned once more to number 19 Riddle Street. The hallway remained quiet. The stain where the umbrella had stood seemed almost permanent now. The detective paused beside it. A widow with rose-scented handkerchiefs, a wealthy family connected to forged records, a burned piece of stationery marked M, a nephew named Miles. And somewhere behind those facts waited the reason Jonah Vale had died. Arthur Bell looked down the corridor. The case had grown larger than the boarding house, larger than Simon Bragg, larger than rent disputes and stolen engagements. Jonah Vale had sold silence. For years he had traded secrets for money. Eventually, such a business attracts dangerous customers. The detective suspected he had finally found one. The difficulty lay in determining whether the letter M belonged to a frightened widow, or to someone far more willing to kill. Chapter 6. The Umbrella's Hidden Rib. The umbrella returned to Riddle Street on Friday morning. Not as an umbrella, as evidence. The distinction mattered. Objects change character once a murder touches them. A chair becomes a witness, a letter becomes a threat, a handkerchief becomes a timeline, and an umbrella becomes a suspect. Detective Arthur Bell carried it into the boarding house wrapped in brown paper. Mrs. Lorne saw it immediately. Her face paled. "Oh," Bell nodded. "Yes, I hoped never to see it again. Many people share that feeling." The landlady stared at the package. "Did the laboratory find anything?" "Several things." "Blood?" "No." "Fingerprints?" "Very few." "Then what?" Bell looked toward the staircase. The interesting part. He carried the umbrella upstairs to Jonah Vale's room. The dead man's desk remained crowded with notes, photographs, envelopes, and theories in various stages of disappointment. Bell laid the umbrella across the desktop. The black fabric appeared ordinary, too ordinary. That had bothered him from the beginning. Murderers who leave obvious clues rarely leave genuine ones. They leave advertisements. The detective opened the umbrella carefully. The ribs spread outward. Metal glinted in the sunlight. The laboratory report rested beside him. He read it again, then examined the frame, then read it again. A knock interrupted him. Dr. Harris entered. The medical examiner removed his hat and immediately regretted the effort. The room was hot enough to discourage movement. "You wanted me?" "Yes." Bell pointed toward the umbrella. The doctor frowned. "I thought we were finished with that thing." "So did the murderer." Dr. Harris approached. "What am I looking for?" Bell pointed. "That rib." The doctor leaned closer, then closer still. A moment later he grunted. "Interesting." One metal rib differed slightly from the others. Not enough for casual observation, enough for careful examination. The metal had been altered, filed, sharpened, refined, the end tapered to a narrow point. Dr. Harris looked up. "Well?" Bell nodded. "Exactly." The doctor examined it again. "Laboratory found traces." "Not anymore." The medical examiner smiled grimly. "Wiped clean. Very clean." The doctor considered the sharpened metal, then thought of the victim, then thought again. Slowly his expression changed. "The wound." Bell waited. Dr. Harris nodded. "The dimensions fit." "Perfectly?" "No, the doctor hated certainty. Bell tolerated it. The wound is narrow enough." "Narrow enough?" "Yes." Dr. Harris folded his arms. "Could this have caused the injury?" "Possibly." "Likely?" "Possibly." Bell smiled. The doctor sighed. "How you hate medical testimony." "No, yes you do. Only when it sounds medical." The doctor laughed despite himself. Then his expression became thoughtful. "If this rib was used." "Yes?" "It wasn't accidental." "No." "It was prepared." "Yes." The doctor nodded. "Someone sharpened it deliberately." Bell looked down at the umbrella. That much was obvious. The question was why. Because the sharpened rib created a contradiction, a large contradiction. If the umbrella had been the murder weapon, why leave it behind? Murderers occasionally forget weapons. They rarely forget specially modified weapons. Those require effort, planning, preparation. No. The umbrella had not been abandoned accidentally. It had been displayed. Bell felt increasingly certain of that. The doctor left shortly afterward. The detective remained alone. The sharpened rib glimmered quietly. He stared at it for several minutes, then returned to the laboratory report. The rib had been cleaned thoroughly, too thoroughly. The rest of the umbrella contained ordinary dust and residue. The sharpened rib looked polished. The murderer had wanted it noticed. Eventually, not immediately, eventually, that distinction mattered. Bell closed the report, then stood and walked into the hallway. The stain remained, fainter now, still visible, like a memory refusing to leave. The detective positioned himself where Jonah Vale had sat before death, then looked toward the umbrella's original location. A strange thought occurred, not new, merely delayed. The umbrella had dominated the investigation from the beginning. Every witness discussed it, every tenant feared it, every clue seemed connected to it. That was suspicious. Evidence should illuminate a murder. This umbrella illuminated itself, as though someone desperately wanted attention directed toward it. Bell returned to the desk. The hidden notebook remained open. Pages of blackmail, pages of payments, pages of fear. He began reading again, slowly, methodically. Hours passed. Outside, the heat continued. Inside, the detective hunted patterns. Most entries involved money. Some involved letters. Others involved debts. Several concerned reputations. One concerned an umbrella. SBU summer umbrella. Payment due. Bell stared at it, then read it again and again. Summer umbrella. Not umbrella. Summer umbrella. Specific. Unnecessarily specific. The detective leaned back. Something stirred in memory. Not a fact. An impression. He closed the notebook, then walked downstairs. Simon Bragg sat in the dining room. The clerk appeared exhausted. Bell was beginning to suspect exhaustion had become the official uniform of number 19 Riddle Street. "Mr. Bragg," the clerk looked up. "Detective." Bell sat opposite him. "What color was it?" Bragg blinked. "What?" "The umbrella." Confusion crossed his face. "The old one?" "Yes." "The one connected to your trouble at Morton and Blackwell." Bragg frowned. "Why?" "Humor me," the clerk thought. Then laughed softly. "White. Bell became still. White? Yes. Not black? No. Bragg looked puzzled. It was a summer umbrella. The detective's pulse quickened. Describe it. It belonged to Mrs. Morton. Go on. White fabric. The clerk smiled faintly. Ridiculous thing. Bell leaned forward. Continue. It was carried at a company picnic. And? It disappeared. The clerk's expression darkened. The missing contracts were hidden inside it. The detective sat back slowly. Interesting. Very interesting. And suddenly the notebook entry changed meaning. SB, summer umbrella, payment due, not black umbrella, not murder umbrella, a completely different umbrella, a completely different scandal, which meant something important. The black umbrella in the hallway was not evidence against Simon Bragg. It merely resembled evidence against Simon Bragg. The distinction was enormous. Bell thanked him and returned upstairs. The pieces shifted again. The murderer had left a black umbrella. The notebook contained an umbrella reference connected to Simon Bragg. Anyone discovering the notebook would immediately suspect Bragg, especially after finding the umbrella, especially after learning about the earlier scandal. The trap became visible, and once visible, it became clumsy. Bell smiled. The murderer had made a mistake. Very clever mistake, but still a mistake. The umbrella was not meant to identify the killer. It was meant to identify a suspect. There is a difference, a large difference. The afternoon brought another development. Miss Parker knocked on Vale's door while Bell worked. "May I speak with you?" Of course, she entered cautiously. The young woman seemed nervous, not unusual. Nearly everyone in the building seemed nervous. "What is it?" She hesitated, then said, "I remembered something." Bell waited. It seemed foolish. "Excellent." "What? Important memories usually do." She smiled faintly, then became serious. "The umbrella." "Yes?" "I think someone wanted me to see it." Bell became very still. "Explain." The young woman folded her hands. "When I opened my door." "Yes?" "The umbrella was turned toward my room." Bell stared. "What do you mean?" "The handle." Bell rose immediately. "Show me." They went into the hallway. Miss Parker indicated the exact position. "The umbrella stood here." "Yes." "The handle faced my door." Bell looked, then imagined, then looked again. Interesting. Very interesting. Because open umbrellas do not naturally face specific directions, someone had placed it deliberately, very deliberately. "Why does that matter?" she asked. Bell answered slowly. "Because messages require audiences." The young woman frowned. "I don't understand." "Neither do I, not yet." But the thought remained. That evening, Bell gathered every tenant into the dining room, not for an accusation, not yet, for observation. People reveal themselves most clearly when frightened together. The detective placed the umbrella in the center of the table. The reactions arrived instantly. Mrs. Lorne recoiled. Simon Bragg stared. Nora Finch looked confused. Caleb Moss looked irritated. Harold Venn looked alarmed. Ada Pike crossed herself. Miss Parker became pale. Bell watched carefully. One reaction mattered more than the others. Not fear, recognition. Very brief, very subtle. Gone almost immediately, but present. Someone knew something about the umbrella. Something specific. The detective filed it away. Afterward, as darkness settled over Riddle Street, Bell remained alone in the dining room. The umbrella rested across the table, silent, patient, deceptive. The sharpened rib suggested murder, too conveniently. The notebook suggested Simon Bragg, too conveniently. The position in the hallway suggested a message, too deliberately. At last, the detective understood. Not the entire case, not yet, but one essential truth. The umbrella had never been intended merely as a weapon. It was theater, a performance, a signal, a warning, a message. And messages are always meant for someone. Bell looked toward the staircase. Somewhere among the tenants stood the intended recipient, not Jonah Vale, not the police, not the city, one specific person. The murderer had planted the umbrella so that person would see it and understand. The question was no longer why the umbrella had been left behind. The question was who it had been speaking to, and once Arthur Bell answered that question, he suspected the rest of the mystery would begin unraveling very quickly. Chapter 7. The Cellar Window. On Saturday morning, Detective Arthur Bell returned to the cellar. He had already visited it 3 times. That fact did not discourage him. The best hiding place for evidence is often the place everybody believes has already been searched. Murderers count on boredom. Bell never did. The heat wave remained unbroken. Outside, the city baked beneath a cloudless sky. Inside number 19 Riddle Street, the atmosphere felt even heavier. Fear had become a permanent resident. The tenants spoke softly. Doors closed quickly. Meals were eaten in silence. And somewhere among them, Bell knew, sat a person who understood the meaning of the umbrella. That thought continued to bother him, not because it was mysterious, because it was personal. The umbrella had not been left as a message to the police. It had not been left for Jonah Vale. It had been left for one particular observer, a private signal disguised as public evidence. The detective descended the cellar stairs carrying a lantern despite the daylight. The cellar possessed windows. They simply preferred darkness. Dust floated through the beam of light. Old furniture lurked in corners. Coal bins stood against the rear wall. Nothing appeared unusual, which was precisely why Bell distrusted it. He moved slowly toward the back. The damp cloth had already been collected. The flower stems had already been examined. The bottle of rose hair tonic sat downtown in evidence storage. Yet something still bothered him. The route. Everyone talked about the alley gate, the scratched bolt, the service entrance. But Bell had learned long ago that the most obvious route is often the wrong one. He stopped behind the coal bins. There, a narrow opening, half hidden by years of neglect. The detective smiled. "Good morning." The window did not answer. He had not expected it to. The opening measured barely 18 inches across, large enough for a determined adult, certainly large enough for a slender one. The frame sat near ground level outside, opening directly into the alley. Bell crouched. The dust beneath the window had been disturbed. Recently, very recently. Interesting. He examined the latch. Fresh scratches covered the metal. Bright scratches, new scratches. Not years old, not months old, days old. The marks matched a thin blade or tool. Someone had forced the latch, not violently, professionally. Bell leaned closer, then stopped. Something clung to the frame, tiny, almost invisible. A thread. Black. The detective removed it carefully. Wool. Dark wool, the sort used in respectable clothing. Not enough for identification, enough for confirmation. Someone had entered through the window. The cellar had not merely contained evidence, it had served as an entrance. Bell sat back and considered the implications. The alley, the cellar window, the rose tonic, the wet umbrella, the hallway, Jonah Vale. The sequence arranged itself neatly, too neatly. The detective disliked neatness. Murder usually preferred confusion. Still, the route now appeared obvious. The killer entered from the alley, opened the cellar window, climbed inside, prepared the umbrella, wet it deliberately, added rose scent, carried it upstairs, positioned it in the hall, turned off the hallway light, waited. Simple, logical, understandable. Which left only one problem. Why? Bell remained crouched beside the window. That question had followed him since the first night. Not how, not who. Why rain? Why create the appearance of rainfall during the worst drought of the summer? Why manufacture something impossible? The answer had to matter, otherwise the effort made no sense. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Find something? Bell turned. Simon Bragg stood at the cellar stairs. The clerk looked pale, again. The man seemed determined to become progressively less healthy. Yes. Bragg descended cautiously. The window. The window. The clerk stared. I never knew that was there. Bell believed him. Most people never notice the details that eventually destroy them. Bragg looked uncomfortable. Do you still think the umbrella was meant to blame me? Bell studied him. Do you? The clerk hesitated, then nodded. Yes. Why? Because of the notebook. The summer umbrella entry. Yes. Bell smiled faintly. Perhaps. Bragg sighed. The answer clearly provided no comfort. After he left, Bell continued searching. The cellar rewarded persistence. Behind another stack of crates, he discovered something else. Not important enough to solve the case. Important enough to sharpen it. A small scrap of paper, water-damaged, partially destroyed. The surviving words were few. When it rains. Nothing more. Just 3 words. Bell stared, then folded the fragment carefully. When it rains. Interesting. Very interesting. An hour later, he sat in Jonah Vale's room studying the notebook again. The dead man's records now appeared less like accounts and more like maps. Each page connected people. Each name connected secrets. Each secret connected fear. The detective stopped at an unfamiliar entry. M.K. Rain story. Settled. M.K. Martha Keene. Bell's pulse quickened slightly. Rain story. Another reference. Rain, umbrella, drought. The same theme appeared repeatedly. Not coincidence. Pattern and patterns mattered. He closed the notebook and visited Martha Keene's residence that afternoon. The widow received him politely, less warmly than before. Detectives have that effect. Mrs. Keene. Detective. Bell sat opposite her. What does rain mean to you? Silence. The widow stared, then laughed softly. Not because the question amused her, because it frightened her. That interested Bell enormously. What kind of question is that? A direct one. Mrs. Keene looked away. I don't understand. Bell waited. She folded her hands. Then unfolded them, then reached for her handkerchief. The familiar scent of roses drifted through the room. Mrs. Keene. Yes? What is the rain story? Her face lost color. Not much. Enough. Bell remained silent. The widow looked toward the window. Toward the door. Anywhere except at him. Finally she spoke. Years ago my husband altered financial reports. Bell nodded. That much he knew. There was an investigation. Official? No. Then what? A private audit. The widow's voice had become quiet. Very quiet. My husband created false records. Bell listened. He claimed certain shipments had been damaged by rain. The detective became still. Continue. The shipments never existed. Interesting. Very interesting. The phrase became a joke. What phrase? Mrs. Keene closed her eyes. When it rains. Bell understood immediately. A code. Not weather. A reference. A memory. A threat. The widow continued. Anyone mentioning rain in connection with those records meant blackmail. The room became silent. At last. A reason, not a complete reason, but a reason. The detective left shortly afterward. His thoughts moved quickly. The umbrella represented rain, artificial rain, impossible rain, manufactured rain. Not because someone wanted to imitate weather, because someone wanted to invoke a memory. A specific memory, a private meaning, a message. Bell returned to Riddle Street near evening. The boarding house looked tired. The tenants looked worse. Miss Parker sat alone in the parlor reading, or pretending to read. Bell sat opposite her. Miss Parker. She looked up. Detective. What does rain mean to you? The question startled her. Not frightened. Startled. Different. Rain. Yes. No idea. Bell nodded. A genuine reaction. Not useful, but genuine. Later he asked the same question of Harold Venn. Then Nora Finch. Then Caleb Moss. Then Ada Pike. The answers varied. None mattered, until Simon Bragg. The clerk looked at Bell in confusion. Rain? Yes. Bragg frowned. Then slowly his expression changed. Recognition, not of weather. Of something else. Mr. Bragg? The clerk swallowed. There was a phrase. Bell became very still. What phrase? When it rains. The detective waited. The clerk looked miserable. I heard Vale use it. When? Several times. To whom? I don't know. What did it mean? Bragg hesitated, then answered, Payment. Bell's pulse quickened. Payment? Yes. The clerk looked toward the floor. Vale would say, When it rains, everyone pays eventually. The detective stared. The phrase again, not weather, money, blackmail, threat, memory, message. Everything converged. The umbrella, the drought, the rosewater, the widow, the notebook, the phrase. The detective walked upstairs afterward and stood alone in the hallway. The stain had nearly vanished now. Only a faint shadow remained. Yet the umbrella still dominated the case. Because the umbrella was never really an umbrella. It was language, a sentence written without words, a signal designed for someone who understood its meaning. The killer had entered through the cellar window. That much was now certain. The scratches proved it. The cloth thread proved it. The route made sense, but the route solved only movement, not motive, not meaning. Bell looked toward Jonah Vale's room. The dead blackmailer had recognized the umbrella immediately. That was why he wrote those final words. Black umbrella. Hall not because the umbrella was strange, because the umbrella meant something, the same way rain meant something, the same way roses meant something, the same way the phrase, when it rains, meant something. Someone had staged rainfall during a summer drought. Not to fool the police, not to disguise footprints, not to create confusion, to communicate. And somewhere in that communication lay the reason Jonah Vale had died. Arthur Bell smiled faintly. For the first time since the investigation began, the umbrella no longer looked like evidence. It looked like a sentence. The challenge was learning how to read it. Chapter 8. The Engagement. That drowned by Sunday morning, Arthur Bell possessed enough facts to arrest 3 innocent people. He regarded that as progress. Murder investigations often advance through the elimination of attractive mistakes. The wrong answer usually arrives first because it is eager. The right answer tends to be shy. Bell sat alone in Jonah Vale's room with the black notebook open before him. The pages seemed different now. Earlier they had looked like records, then they looked like motives. Now they looked like traps. Vale had spent years collecting secrets, but he had not merely sold silence, he had sold fear. Fear had built the boarding house around him. Fear had paid his rent. Fear had kept his victims obedient, and fear, Bell suspected, had eventually killed him. The detective closed the notebook and stared out the window. The city remained trapped beneath the heat wave. Even the distant rooftops appeared exhausted. Below, Riddle Street moved slowly through another suffocating day. A knock sounded at the door. Bell looked up. Simon Bragg stood in the hallway. The clerk appeared worse than usual. Bell had not thought that possible. Mr. Bragg. The man entered. His face looked pale. His eyes looked hollow. And for the first time since the investigation began, he appeared tired of being frightened. Detective. Bell gestured toward a chair. Bragg sat. Neither spoke immediately. Silence can be useful. It encourages truth. Eventually. The clerk stared at the floor, then said quietly, "The umbrella was for me." Bell remained motionless. "Explain." Bragg laughed bitterly. "Not because anything was amusing. Because some pains eventually become ridiculous. You already know. I know many things. Not this." Bell waited. The clerk rubbed his hands together, then looked up. "What do you think happened to my engagement?" The detective considered. "Ellen Marsh left." That was later. Interesting, very interesting. Bell leaned back. "Go on." Bragg stared toward the window. His voice became distant, as though he were speaking to someone several years dead. There was another engagement. The detective said nothing. "Before Ellen? Who? A woman named Clara Denton?" The name meant nothing. Yet. Bragg swallowed. "We were supposed to marry. What happened?" The clerk closed his eyes. For several seconds he said nothing. Then the words emerged. "She died." The room became very quiet. Bell folded his hands. "How?" Bragg laughed again. The sound carried no humor. "Officially?" "Yes." "She slipped from a bridge during a storm." The detective became still. Outside, somewhere in the city, a distant automobile horn sounded. Inside, neither man moved. A storm. Bell said softly. Yes. Interesting. Very interesting. The clerk nodded. It rained all night. Bell thought about rain. The notebook, the umbrella, the message, the code, the phrase. Everything suddenly felt closer. What really happened? Bell asked. Bragg looked away. For the first time since entering the room, genuine fear crossed his face. Not fear of prison. Not fear of suspicion. Older fear, deeper fear, memory, we argued. About what? It doesn't matter. It mattered then. The clerk nodded slowly. Yes, he swallowed. She wanted to leave. And? I became angry. Bell remained silent. People reveal more when uninterrupted. We argued on the bridge. The clerk's hands tightened. The storm was terrible. Rain, umbrella, storm. The pattern continued. Then what happened? Bragg closed his eyes. She fell. The detective watched him carefully. No. The clerk opened his eyes. What? No. Bragg stared. Bell's voice remained calm. You chose the wrong verb. The room became silent. At last, the clerk whispered, She was pushed. Bell nodded once. Not surprise, confirmation. Simon Bragg lowered his head. Years of shame seemed to settle onto his shoulders. It wasn't supposed to happen. The detective said nothing. I grabbed her arm. Silence. She pulled away. More silence. We struggled. The clerk's voice broke. Then she went over. The room remained quiet. Bell had heard confessions before. Hundreds. Some false, some true, most incomplete. What happened afterward? Bragg stared at the floor. I ran with the umbrella. The clerk looked up sharply. Bell watched him. Understanding appeared. Slowly. Painfully. Yes. The answer barely emerged. I still had the umbrella. There it was, the connection, the black umbrella, the storm, the bridge, the dead fiancé, the code. Everything converged. The detective leaned back. When did Jonah Vale learn this? Bragg laughed weakly. Years later. How? He was there. Bell became very still. What? The clerk nodded miserably. He witnessed it. Interesting, very interesting. Perhaps the most interesting fact in the entire investigation. You never mentioned that. I couldn't. Why not? Bragg smiled bitterly. Would you? A fair question. Bell ignored it. Vale saw Clara die. Yes. He knew you pushed her. Yes. He blackmailed you. Yes. For years. The clerk nodded. The detective stood and walked toward the window. His thoughts moved quickly. Very quickly. A storm. A death. An umbrella. A witness. A blackmailer. And now, years later, another dead body. The symmetry felt deliberate. Too deliberate. Bell turned. When did Vale threaten to expose you? Constantly. No. Recently. Bragg hesitated, then answered. 3 days before he died. What exactly did he say? The clerk's face darkened. He said the rain was coming again. The detective's pulse quickened. What? Bragg nodded. He always used that phrase. When it rains. Yes. The code. Again. Always the code. Bell sat down. For several moments neither man spoke. At last the detective asked the obvious question. Did you kill him? Bragg looked exhausted. Would you believe me if I said no? Perhaps. The clerk laughed softly. No. Why? Because I hated him. A fair answer. Did you threaten him? Many times. Did you visit him that night? No. Bell watched carefully. The answer appeared genuine, not certain, but genuine. The clerk continued. I wanted him dead. That is common. I imagined it. Also common. I even hoped it would happen. Still common. Bragg managed a weak smile. You are not helping. I am not trying to. The clerk looked away, then said quietly, I didn't kill him. Bell believed him. Not completely. Enough. There is a difference. Later that afternoon, the detective reviewed every statement collected since the murder. The picture changed dramatically. Simon Bragg possessed motive. Strong motive. Powerful motive. Perhaps the strongest in the building. Yet something bothered Bell. Not the confession. The timing. The umbrella had been designed to point toward Bragg. The notebook entry. The storm connection. The rain code. The symbolism. Everything directed suspicion toward him, too efficiently. The detective disliked efficiency in murder. Real killers make mistakes. Framing makes plans. As evening approached, Bell visited the city archives. The bridge death proved easy enough to locate. Newspapers had reported it. A young woman stormed accident, no witnesses, case closed, except there had been a witness, Jonah Vale. The article included one additional detail, a detail that made Bell stop reading. Then read again, then a third time. Interesting. Very interesting. The bridge stood beside a river warehouse district. Several businesses occupied the area at the time. One of them had belonged to Keene Shipping. Bell sat back slowly. The name echoed through his thoughts. Keene again, always Keene, Martha Keene. The forged records, the rain code, the expensive stationery, the letter M, the nephew Miles, the warehouse district. The detective stared out the archive window. Coincidences existed, but they rarely traveled in groups. He returned to Riddle Street after dark. The boarding house remained awake despite the hour. Nobody slept much anymore. Fear kept strange hours. Bell found Miss Parker reading in the parlor. Again. The young woman seemed to live there now. Detective. Miss Parker, she studied his expression. You learned something. Several things. About Simon. Bell nodded. Her face tightened. You think he did it? No. The answer surprised her. Why not? The detective sat opposite her. Because he is too useful. Miss Parker frowned. Useful? Yes. I don't understand. Bell smiled faintly. Neither does the murderer. The young woman looked puzzled. The detective continued. Suppose you wanted someone suspected. All right. You choose a man with a dark secret. Yes. You create a clue connected to that secret, she thought. The umbrella. Exactly. Understanding appeared slowly. You mean someone wanted Simon blamed? Very much. Miss Parker looked toward the staircase. Then the confession helps him. No. The detective's smile widened slightly. It helps me. The room became quiet. The young woman studied him. You already know who did it. Bell considered. No, not yet. Not completely. Miss Parker sighed. That sounds frustrating. It is. The detective rose, then paused. One final thought had occurred. A dangerous thought. If the umbrella represented the bridge and the storm and Simon Bragg's guilt. Then the murderer had known that story, known it intimately, known enough to transform it into a message, known enough to weaponize memory. Bell climbed the stairs slowly. At the top landing, he looked down the hallway. The stain left by the umbrella had nearly vanished. Only a faint shadow remained, yet its purpose had become clear. The umbrella had not been left to identify the killer. It had been left to identify Simon Bragg, to remind him, to frighten him, to implicate him. The poor clerk had spent years paying Jonah Vale for silence, and now, after the blackmailer's death, that same fear had made him the perfect suspect. Arthur Bell stood alone in the corridor. Somewhere behind the walls, a murderer believed the plan was working. The detective suspected otherwise, because fear can point toward guilt, but it can also point away from it. And Simon Bragg's terror looked less and less like the terror of a killer. It looked like the terror of a man being carefully framed. Chapter 9. The Wrong Guilty Man. By Monday evening, the heat wave had finally begun to weaken. Not enough to cool the city, just enough to give people hope. Arthur Bell distrusted hope. In detective, work hope frequently arrived 10 minutes before disappointment. The boarding house at number 19 Riddle Street felt unusually quiet. The silence carried a strained quality, like a rope stretched too tightly. Everyone sensed the end approaching, not because the weather was changing, because the investigation was. Bell had spent the entire day confirming details, checking statements, reviewing timelines, visiting offices, examining records, and shortly before sunset, one important piece finally settled into place. The detective smiled, not because he enjoyed being right, because uncertainty had become tiresome. At 7 o'clock, he asked Mrs. Lorne to gather everyone in the dining room. The request produced immediate anxiety. People become nervous whenever detectives invite them into one room. They assume the evening will end badly. Often they are correct. By 7:30, the tenants had assembled. Simon Bragg sat nearest the door. Miss Parker occupied a chair beside the window. Nora Finch and Ada Pike sat together. Caleb Moss leaned against the wall. Harold Venn looked as though he wished to be somewhere else. Mrs. Lorne stood beside the sideboard. Martha Keene arrived shortly afterward. The widow appeared calm, too calm. Bell noticed. He noticed everything now. The black umbrella rested across the center of the dining table, like a guest of honor. Nobody seemed pleased to see it. The detective remained standing. For several moments he said nothing. Silence is useful. It sharpens attention. Eventually Bell spoke. "Thank you for coming." Nobody replied. He nodded toward Simon Bragg. "Mr. Bragg has been the most convenient suspect." The clerk closed his eyes. The others looked toward him immediately. Bell continued. The umbrella pointed toward him. The notebook pointed toward him. The storm story pointed toward him. The blackmail pointed toward him. The detective paused. "Which is exactly why he interests me less than he did before." Simon looked up. Mrs. Lorne frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Bell said calmly, "that someone worked very hard to make Mr. Bragg appear guilty." The room became still. The detective removed several papers from his pocket. "This afternoon I visited the telegraph office on Broad Street." Simon stared. Bell nodded. 3 witnesses identified Mr. Bragg. The clerk blinked. "What?" "You were there." "I know I was there." Fortunately, the detective looked around the room. "The time matters." Miss Parker leaned forward. "Why?" "Because Jonah Vale died shortly after 1 o'clock. Bell held up a paper. "The telegraph office received a message from Mr. Bragg at 12:48. Another paper. "A clerk spoke with him at 12:53. A third paper. "A messenger saw him leave shortly after 1. The detective folded the documents. "The office is too far away." Understanding began spreading around the room. Slowly, reluctantly. Bell nodded. Simon Bragg could not have killed Jonah Vale. The silence that followed felt enormous. The clerk looked stunned, as though freedom itself had arrived unexpectedly. Mrs. Lorne spoke first. "Then why all the clues?" Bell smiled faintly. "An excellent question." He picked up the umbrella. The black fabric caught the lamplight. This umbrella was not left behind by accident. Nobody moved. It was displayed. Bell walked slowly around the table. It contained a sharpened rib, a possible murder weapon, a reminder of a storm, a reminder of Simon Bragg's past, a reminder of Clara Denton's death. He stopped. Everything about it pointed towards Simon. The clerk stared at the floor. Bell continued, "Which means someone wanted Simon frightened, or blamed, or both." The detective returned to the head of the table. "And that brings us to Mrs. Martha Keene." The widow became very still. No surprise, no outrage, only stillness. "Interesting. Very interesting." Bell turned toward her. "The roses." She said nothing. "The handkerchief." Nothing. "The blackmail." Still nothing. "The forged records." The widow closed her eyes. Bell nodded. "Yes." The room remained silent. The detective continued. "Your late husband falsified shipping documents. Rain became a code. Jonah Vale discovered it. He blackmailed you." The widow's shoulders sagged, slightly. "Enough." Bell removed the burned stationery fragment. "The paper came from your household." Martha Keene stared at it, then looked away. "The letter M." The detective paused. "Your name?" At last she spoke. "No." The answer surprised everyone, Bell included. The widow looked exhausted, years older than she had appeared previously. "No." Bell studied her. "Explain." She laughed softly. "Not because anything was amusing, because resistance had become impossible. The paper is mine. Yes. The roses are mine. Yes. The payments are mine. Yes." Martha Keene looked down at her hands. "The murder is not." The room remained silent. Bell waited. The widow continued. "I went there that night." Mrs. Lorne gasped. Several tenants exchanged looks. The widow ignored them. I entered through the alley. Bell became attentive. Continue. I did not want anyone seeing me. Reasonable. I used the cellar window. The detective nodded slowly. The scratches, the cloth thread, the root, everything fit. Martha Keene continued. I carried money. How much? Enough to end the blackmail. Interesting. Very interesting. The detective remained silent. I intended to pay him. What happened? The widow closed her eyes. He wasn't alone. Bell became very still. Who was with him? I don't know. The answer sounded genuine. That interested him. I heard voices, arguing. A man and a woman. The room became completely silent. Mrs. Lorne's face changed. Only briefly, Bell noticed. I became frightened. Martha Keene continued. I left. Immediately. Yes? Before the murder? Yes. Bell nodded. The widow's story fit many facts. Too many to ignore, not enough to convict, enough to understand. You carried roses. She looked surprised. How did you know? The florist. Understanding crossed her face. The widow lowered her head. They were meant as a warning. A warning. To myself. Bell almost smiled. People create remarkably complicated rituals around guilt. The room remained quiet. At last Miss Parker spoke. If Mrs. Keene didn't kill him. The young woman looked around nervously. Then who did? The detective placed the umbrella back on the table, slowly, deliberately. Then he looked toward Mrs. Lorne. The landlady froze. Bell had been waiting for that reaction. Not panic. Recognition. Recognition is always useful. Mrs. Lorne, her face became pale. What? The detective smiled gently, too gently, dangerously gently. You know every room in this house. Silence. You know every key. Silence. You know every entrance. Silence. You know every tenant. Silence, and most importantly, Bell paused. You know every secret. The room seemed to stop breathing. Mrs. Lorne stared. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The detective continued. When Jonah Vale arrived 3 months ago, he didn't merely rent a room. The landlady looked trapped. He inherited a collection. Bell's voice remained calm. A collection of information. A collection of weaknesses. A collection of fears. The detective looked around the room. Someone had been gathering those fears before Vale. Miss Parker frowned. Simon looked confused. Martha Keene became very still, and suddenly Bell knew he was correct. Not everything. Not yet. Enough. Mrs. Lorne whispered, You're mistaken. No. The answer arrived instantly, firmly, certainly. Bell walked slowly toward her. The notebook proves Vale learned intimate details about every tenant almost immediately. The detective paused, too quickly. Nobody spoke. He didn't discover those secrets himself. Mrs. Lorne's hands trembled. Bell noticed. The information came from someone already inside the house. Silence. The landlady. Mrs. Lorne looked as though she might collapse. But Bell was not finished. Not even close. Because one final piece still remained hidden. The motive, the actual reason, the explanation that connected rain, roses, umbrellas, blackmail, and murder. He could see it now, almost, like a figure behind frosted glass, close enough to recognize, not close enough to identify. The detective stepped back. The room remained frozen. Mrs. Lorne stared at him. Bell stared back. Neither moved. Finally he spoke. Quietly, deliberately. You know something about Jonah Vale's death that nobody else knows. The landlady swallowed. Once, twice, 3 times, then said nothing. Arthur Bell nodded slowly. That silence told him more than any answer could have. The wrong guilty person had finally been removed from the board. Simon Bragg was innocent. Martha Keene was frightened. The umbrella was a message, and somewhere behind Mrs. Lorne's terrified eyes waited the truth, the complete truth, the kind that ends murders, and Bell intended to hear it tomorrow. Chapter 10. The rain that never fell. The weather finally broke on Tuesday. Not dramatically, not with thunder, not with lightning. A few grey clouds drifted across the city shortly after dawn, and a cool wind moved through the streets for the first time in more than 2 weeks. The irony would have amused Arthur Bell if he had been in the mood for amusement. After all, the solution to the case involved rain. Rain that never fell. At 7 o'clock that evening, every person connected to Jonah Vale's death sat inside the dining room of number 19 Riddle Street. The room felt crowded, not because of the people, because of the accumulated weight of secrets. Simon Bragg sat near the window. Miss Parker occupied her usual chair. Nora Finch, Caleb Moss, Ada Pike and Harold Venn sat together along one wall. Martha Keene sat quietly beside the fireplace. Mrs. Lorne occupied a chair near the head of the table. The black umbrella rested before her. Arthur Bell remained standing. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed encouragement to listen. The detective folded his hands. "Thank you for coming." Silence. Bell nodded toward the umbrella. Jonah Vale died because of this. Several people glanced toward it. The black fabric looked ordinary. It had looked ordinary from the beginning. That had always been part of the deception. The detective continued. The mistake was believing the umbrella represented weather. Nobody moved. It did not. Bell walked slowly around the table. It represented memory. His gaze settled briefly upon Simon Bragg. The clerk lowered his eyes. Bell nodded. Years ago, Simon Bragg argued with Clara Denton on a bridge during a storm. The room remained silent. She died. Bragg's hands tightened. The detective continued. Jonah Vale witnessed the event. Whether it was an accident or something worse hardly mattered afterward. What mattered was leverage. Bell stopped beside the umbrella. Vale spent years using that night as a source of income. Nobody interrupted. The detective picked up the umbrella. The storm, the rain, the umbrella, the phrase "when it rains." They became tools, reminders, threats. The room remained quiet. Bell turned toward Simon. "You believed the umbrella was meant for you." The clerk nodded miserably. "Yes, and that was exactly the intention." Bell's voice hardened slightly. "The murderer wanted you frightened, wanted you suspicious, wanted you guilty." Simon stared. The detective placed the umbrella back on the table. "Because you were the perfect suspect." Mrs. Lorne swallowed. Bell noticed. "Not because you killed Jonah Vale." The detective paused. "Because somebody else had a much darker secret." The room seemed to tighten. Martha Keene lowered her eyes. Miss Parker leaned forward. Nobody spoke. Arthur Bell looked directly at Mrs. Lorne. The landlady became very pale. "Mrs. Lorne," her lips trembled. "I don't know what you're talking about." Bell smiled sadly. "Yes, you do." Silence. The detective continued. "Several facts troubled me from the beginning. The umbrella, the roses, the cellar, the notebook. But most of all, the blackmail records." He lifted Jonah Vale's notebook from the table. "These pages contain secrets belonging to every tenant." Bell looked around the room. Too many secrets. Too quickly, too conveniently, the detective opened the notebook. Jonah Vale arrived only 3 months ago, yet he somehow learned intimate details about everyone. Bell paused. That was impossible. No one moved, unless someone taught him. The detective closed the notebook. Someone who already knew. His eyes settled on Mrs. Lorne. The landlady looked trapped. The owner of the house. Silence. You listened. You watched. You collected stories. You learned weaknesses. Bell's voice remained calm. When Jonah Vale arrived, you supplied information. Mrs. Lorne shook her head weakly. No. Yes. The answer arrived instantly. Bell continued. At first, you profited. Then you became vulnerable. The landlady stared. The detective walked slowly toward her. Jonah Vale discovered something. Something he did not learn from the tenants. Something he learned about you. Mrs. Lorne closed her eyes. The room remained perfectly silent. Arthur Bell stopped beside the table. Years ago you had another name. Nobody moved. Years ago you knew Clara Denton. The landlady's hands began shaking. Simon looked up sharply. The detective continued. You knew her before the bridge. Mrs. Lorne whispered. No. Belle ignored her. You loved the same man. The room became still. Simon stared in confusion. The detective nodded. Not Simon Bragg. That surprised everyone, especially Simon. Belle continued. Another man. A man Clara intended to marry before Simon. The landlady lowered her head. The detective's voice softened. Clara ended that relationship. You never forgave her. Tears appeared in Mrs. Lorne's eyes. Nobody spoke. Arthur Bell continued. On the night of the storm, you followed her. You followed her to the bridge. Simon stared. Martha Keene stared. Everyone stared. The detective nodded. Simon argued with Clara, then left. Bragg looked shocked. What? Bell turned toward him. You told us you ran? Yes. You did. The detective's gaze returned to Mrs. Lorne, but Clara was still alive. The room became utterly silent. Mrs. Lorne began crying quietly. Bell continued. You stayed. You confronted her. You argued. And when she stood near the edge, the detective paused. The silence felt enormous. You pushed her. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The landlady covered her face. A broken sound escaped her, and Bell knew, absolutely knew. The final uncertainty vanished. Simon whispered, My God. Mrs. Lorne sobbed once, then again, then looked up. Years seemed to settle upon her face. She took everything. Nobody interrupted. Everything. Her voice trembled. She never even knew. Tears ran down her cheeks. I only wanted to frighten her. Bell said nothing. I only wanted her afraid. The landlady laughed bitterly. The same thing Jonah Vale wanted from everyone. Silence at last. The truth. Mrs. Lorne wiped her eyes. When Vale learned, she stopped, then continued. He found an old letter. Bell nodded. The letter. The hidden secret. The true blackmail. He knew. The landlady laughed again. He knew everything. Nobody spoke. He discovered Clara. He discovered the bridge. He discovered me. The room remained silent. Mrs. Lorne looked toward Simon. I let him believe he was guilty. The clerk stared. The landlady lowered her head. It was easier. Bell nodded. Exactly, that was the key. Simon Bragg's guilt had hidden the real crime for years. Jonah Vale had understood that. He had exploited it, and eventually he had demanded too much. The detective picked up the umbrella. The sharpened rib. Mrs. Lorne closed her eyes. Bell continued. You entered through the cellar window. You wet the umbrella. You mixed rose tonic with water. You carried it upstairs. The landlady nodded weakly. The detective's voice remained steady. You wanted Simon reminded of the bridge, of the storm, of Clara, of guilt. Simon stared at the floor. Mrs. Lorne whispered, Yes. Bell continued. You extinguished the hallway lamp. You placed the umbrella. You confronted Jonah Vale. And when he threatened you again. The detective touched the sharpened metal rib. You killed him. The room remained silent. The landlady looked exhausted, defeated, finished. Yes. The word barely emerged. Nobody moved. Nobody needed further explanation. The entire puzzle finally fit. The roses, the rain, the umbrella, the blackmail. The bridge, the storm, everything connected. Arthur Bell looked around the room, at frightened tenants, at Martha Keene, at Simon Bragg, at the broken woman who had spent years hiding behind another person's guilt. Then he placed the umbrella back upon the table, carefully, deliberately, like the final piece of evidence it had always been. The reason the case was solved, Bell said quietly, is that the umbrella should never have existed. Nobody spoke. The detective continued. There had been no rain for 12 days. The umbrella was impossible. It demanded explanation. Bell looked toward Mrs. Lorne. You wanted it remembered. You wanted Simon frightened. You wanted the storm brought back to life. The landlady closed her eyes. Tears slid down her face. Arthur Bell nodded slowly. The umbrella carried a storm from the past. Outside, beyond the windows, the first genuine raindrops began tapping softly against the glass. Not many. Just enough. The room listened. No one spoke. No one moved. The sound seemed strangely appropriate. A rain that belonged to the present, not the past. At last, Belle turned toward the waiting officers in the doorway. They stepped forward quietly. Mrs. Lorne did not resist. She appeared relieved, as though exhaustion had finally become stronger than fear. The detective watched them lead her away. Then he looked once more at the black umbrella resting on the table. The impossible object, the clue that should not have existed, the clue that solved everything. Outside, the rain continued falling softly across Riddle Street. Inside, for the first time since Jonah Vale died, the house felt honest, and Arthur Bell, who trusted facts far more than weather, allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The storm was finally over.
I hope you enjoyed the story. Kindly subscribe our channel for more stories like this.